On the 15th of April, 1817, the legislature of the state of New York passed a law authorizing the most expensive construction project ever attempted on the North American continent, a canal 363 miles long, running from the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie at Buffalo, priced at roughly $7 million at a moment when the entire federal budget ran to about $20 million. Buried inside that law, past the sections on commissioners and surveys and land takings, sits one sentence that almost nobody quotes. It pledges to the new canal fund a duty of 12.5 cents on every bushel of salt manufactured in the western district of the state. Not a tax on land, not a tax on income, a tax on salt. The men who wrote that sentence were not being eccentric. They were reaching for the single most dependable stream of money the young republic possessed, because in 1817 salt was not a seasoning sitting quietly on a table. Salt was the substance that kept meat edible through winter, kept armies in the field, kept the frontier from starving, and it moved through the early American economy the way crude oil would move through it a century later. For the first 80 years of the United States, salt worked as currency, as collateral, as a military target, and as the tax base that dug the Erie Canal. And here is the part the textbooks flatten into nothing. The standard account says tolls paid for the canal. But tolls cannot be collected on a canal that does not yet exist, and the borrowing that cut the first miles of that ditch was secured, in meaningful part, on brine boiling out of the ground near a swampy lake in central New York. Over the next several minutes, I am going to trace how one cheap white mineral bankrolled early America, and I will show you a second agreement, signed in November of that same year on a riverbank in Western Virginia, that quietly made a handful of salt makers the first cartel in American history. 65 years before anyone had heard the name Standard Oil. Here is what this story will hand you before it ends. First, the exact clause in the 1817 canal law that pledged salt money to the Erie Canal and what the state controller's own reports say that duty carried. Second, what a single bushel of salt actually bought on the Kentucky frontier, where store ledgers and settler memoirs show salt functioning as literal money with an exchange rate everyone understood. Third, the agreement signed on the 10th of November 1817 along the Kanawha River, which fixed prices, set production quotas, and bound a handful of salt families into the first American trust. Fourth, the price the Revolution put on salt, why the Continental Congress pleaded with the states to subsidize salt works, and why British raiding parties rowed ashore on the New Jersey coast specifically to smash salt pans. And fifth, how the entire salt economy evaporated inside roughly a single decade, where the capital went next, and why the city that salt built eventually needed a new story about itself. One of those 5 threads involves Daniel Boone, a kettle of brine, and one of the worst mornings of his life. That thread comes first. This channel is called Before the System because every institution that runs your life today, the banks, the bonds, the taxes, the markets, had a first crude working version, and the first version is where the power sits in plain view. Today, the first working version of American public finance turns out to be a barrel of salt. To understand what salt was worth, watch what men were willing to risk for it. In January of 1778, the settlement of Boonesboro, Kentucky was coming out of a year of siege and raid with almost no salt left. That sounds like a small domestic problem until you remember what salt did. Without it, the hogs slaughtered in November rotted by February. Without it, hides could not be cured, butter could not be kept, and a stockade full of hunters could starve in a forest full of game. So Daniel Boone led a party of roughly 30 men north to the lower Blue Licks on the Licking River, where salt springs seeped up through the limestone. The work was miserable arithmetic. The brine at the licks was weak, and by the accounts the salt makers left behind, it took hundreds of gallons of spring water hauled and boiled down in iron kettles over fires that never went out to produce a single bushel of salt. The men worked in the cold for weeks, boiling and scraping and packing because that bushel was worth the labor many times over back inside the fort. On the 7th of February, Boone was out hunting meat for the salt camp when he was taken by a Shawnee war party under the leader Blackfish, more than 100 men moving toward Boonesboro in the dead of winter. Boone, calculating that the fort could not survive a surprise assault, talked his salt makers into surrendering without a fight. Nearly the whole party, something like 26 or 27 men, was marched north into captivity across the Ohio. Boonesboro spent that spring stripped of its defenders, and Boone himself would not escape for months, returning just in time to stand the Great Siege of September 1778. Kentucky schoolchildren learn this as a frontier adventure story. Read it instead as an economic document. The most famous woodsman in America, and a tenth of the fighting strength of the Kentucky settlements, spent the hardest weeks of winter doing industrial labor at a salt spring, because salt was the one commodity a settlement could not improvise, could not substitute, and could not live without. And what was true at Blue Licks was true across the entire rebelling seaboard. Before the Revolution, nearly all salt in the colonies arrived by ship, much of it from British sources or through British-controlled trade. When the war closed the ports, the price did not rise politely. Diaries and colonial newspapers from 1776 and 77 record salt selling at 10 and 20 times its pre-war price where it could be found at all, and there are accounts of families riding 100 miles to buy a half bushel. The Continental Congress understood that an army without salt cannot preserve rations, and the population without salt turns mutinous. So Congress urged the states to treat salt making as a matter of survival, and the states responded with bounties, subsidies, and exemptions from militia duty from men who would boil seawater on the shore. The British understood the same arithmetic from the other side, which is why their raiding parties burned salt works along the New Jersey coast the way a later war would bomb refineries. When both sides of a war treat a kitchen mineral as strategic infrastructure, you are not looking at a seasoning, you are looking at money. Now the mechanism, because the mechanism is the whole story. Ask what makes a perfect tax base, the kind a government can borrow against, and you get 3 requirements. Everyone must need the thing, demand must barely move when the price rises, and the thing must pass through a narrow countable choke point where a clerk can stand with a ledger. In the early republic, salt met all 3 tests better than any commodity in existence. Every household needed it every year, rich or poor, and a family putting up pork for winter needed it by the bushel, not the pinch. Demand was almost perfectly rigid, because the alternative to buying salt was watching your meat spoil. And salt came out of the ground at a small number of springs and licks, then moved in standard bushels and barrels that could be measured, stamped, and taxed at the source. New York State grasped this early. The best brine springs in the eastern half of the continent bubbled up beside Onondaga Lake, on land that had belonged to the Onondaga Nation for centuries and that the state acquired through a pair of treaties in 1788 and 1795, treaties whose fairness the Onondaga contest to this day. With reason. In 1797, the legislature organized the springs as a state reservation. Albany did not simply sell the land off. It kept the brine, leased out lots to private boilers, appointed a state superintendent, and collected a duty of a few cents on every bushel that left the works. In other words, 2 decades before anyone shoveled dirt for a canal, New York was already running a state-managed extraction economy, part landlord, part regulator, part tax collector, on the most inelastic commodity in the country. Then came 1817, and the sentence I read you at the start. The Canal Law created a dedicated canal fund and pledged specific revenues into it, chief among them a salt duty raised to 12.5 cents per bushel, alongside duties on goods sold at auction. Understand the sequence, because the sequence is what the textbooks reverse. The state did not build the canal and then pay for it with tolls. The state pledged the salt stream first, borrowed against that pledge second, dug third, and collected tolls last. The lenders who bought New York's canal stock in the early years were not betting on a ditch that did not exist. They were betting on the certainty that Americans would keep salting pork, and the controllers reports through the 1820s list the salt duty year after year as one of the load-bearing pillars of the fund. And then the machine began to feed itself, which is the elegant, slightly sinister part. The canal, once open, cut the cost of moving a ton of freight from Buffalo to New York City by roughly 90%. By the estimates historians commonly cite, cheap transport threw open the entire Western market to Onondaga salt. Production climbed toward millions of bushels a year, and every one of those bushels paid its duty back into the fund that had dug the canal that carried it. Salt financed the canal. The canal enlarged the salt trade, and the enlarged salt trade refilled the treasury. It was a flywheel built out of brine. And the villages around the works, Salina, Liverpool, and the fast-growing town of Syracuse became company towns where the company was the state of New York. New York was not the only place where salt concentrated power. Follow the minerals south and west and you find it building fortunes with a much darker ledger. In 1808, along the Kanawha River in what is now West Virginia, the brothers David and Joseph Ruffner did something genuinely new. Frustrated with weak surface brine, they hammered and drilled down through bedrock using a spring pole rig until they struck strong brine dozens of feet below, and in doing so they helped pioneer the American practice of deep drilling, the same craft that would later be turned on petroleum. Within a decade, dozens of furnaces lined the Kanawha, boiling brine day and night with coal, and the operators discovered the oldest problem in commodity markets. When everyone produces at full tilt, price collapses. Their answer arrived on the 10th of November 1817 when the leading producers signed articles forming the Kanawha Salt Company, an agreement that set production quotas for each member, fixed the price of salt, and routed sales through a common agent. Business historians have called that arrangement the first effective trust in American history, and it predates the Standard Oil Trust by more than 6 decades. Everything Americans would later find shocking about oil, the quotas, the price fixing, the cartel discipline, was rehearsed first in salt on a riverbank before 1820. And the labor beneath those fortunes must be said plainly. The Kanawha salins ran substantially on the labor of enslaved men, thousands of them over the decades, many leased from owners in Eastern Virginia to shovel coal, tend kettles, and cooper barrels in brutal heat. After emancipation, a boy named Booker T. Washington worked beside his stepfather packing salt barrels at Malden on the Kanawha, and he later wrote that the first thing he ever learned to read was the number 18, the mark chalked on his stepfather's barrels. The first American cartel was also an engine of bondage, and both facts belong in the same sentence. Now step back north and west to the Kentucky and Ohio Valley frontier, where salt did something even stranger. It stopped being merely a taxed commodity and started behaving as money itself. Virginia's land laws treated the Great Lakes as assets too valuable for ordinary private claim, and around works like Bullitt's Lick near Louisville, which began boiling commercially in 1779, an entire barter economy denominated itself in salt. Store ledgers from the period carry accounts settled in bushels. Laborers and hunters took wages in salt. Settler memoirs from Kentucky and Illinois record the going rate with the casual precision people reserve for real currency. A bushel of salt for a good cow and her calf in the scarce years, and land, corn, whiskey, and labor were all priced against it. In a cash-starved backcountry where paper money was distrusted and coin was rare, salt had every property a currency needs. It was divisible, durable if kept dry, universally demanded, and impossible to counterfeit. The frontier did not read economics textbooks. It simply reached for the most trusted store of value available, and that store of value was white, granular, and boiled out of a swamp. And if you want proof of what happens when this money runs short, jump forward to the Civil War. The Confederacy discovered within months that it had seceded from its own salt supply. Prices tell the story with brutal clarity. A sack of salt that sold for around $1 or $2 before the war was quoted in some southern markets at $40 and $60 by 1862, where it could be had at all. The works at Saltville, Virginia became so critical, supplying by common estimate a major share of the entire Confederate supply, that salt makers were exempted from the draft. States signed contracts for kettle capacity the way nations contract for munitions, and the discovery of solid rock salt at Avery Island, Louisiana, in May of 1862 was treated as a strategic event which is precisely why Union forces seized the island the following year. In December of 1864, Union cavalry finally broke through and wrecked Saltville, smashing kettles and burning sheds, and historians of the war count that raid among the blows that helped starve the Confederacy's commissary in its final winter. 3 different Americas: a state capital, a cartel riverbank, a frontier store counter, and in all 3, whoever controlled salt controlled the terms of everyone else's survival. I promised you a paper trail, so here it is. 5 documents that carry this entire story, laid end to end in the order history wrote them. Document 1, the Journals of the Continental Congress from 1776, where the delegates, in the middle of fighting for national existence, took time to urge the colonies to promote the manufacture of salt, recommending bounties and encouragement for anyone who would build works on the coast. The states followed through with cash premiums per bushel and militia exemptions for salt boilers, and the fact that men could be excused from carrying a musket in a Revolutionary War in order to boil seawater is the single cleanest measure of what salt was worth in 1776. That closes the first loop from the Boone story. Salt scarcity was not a frontier inconvenience. It was a recognized threat to the war itself. Document 2, the account books of the frontier licks, the store ledgers and settlement records from places like Bullitt's Lick, where you can watch salt operate as the frontier's reserve currency, wages in bushels, debts in bushels, a cow and calf against a bushel in the hard years. No legislature ever declared salt legal tender. It did not need to. Money is whatever everyone accepts, and west of the mountains, everyone accepted salt. Document 3, Chapter 262 of the New York Laws of 1817, the Canal Act, with its pledge of 12.5 cents per bushel to the Canal Fund. Follow it forward through the Comptroller's annual report and you find the salt duty flowing in steadily through the whole construction period, reliable enough that the canal commissioners could keep borrowing through 8 years of digging before the full line opened in 1825, and the state's own accounting through the following decades credits the Onondaga duty with millions of dollars for the fund across its life. When the textbook tells you tolls built the Erie Canal, the honest correction is that credit built the canal, and salt was a load-bearing part of the collateral. Document 4, the Articles of the Kanawha Salt Company, dated the 10th of November, 1817, with